Hello.
Hey, good morning. Well, good afternoon for some. Welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to be here and talking with you today. Today's webinar is on the subject of 5 questions and answers about FDA-compliant temperature mapping. And excited to be here. We're at our US office, the Eupry US office with Jakob. And I am Devin Kelley, our head of US partnerships, and want to go ahead and kick us off today with a welcome to Jakob, who joined us this week.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you in the States. What's been the highlight of your visit so far?
I mean, it's always nice visiting the US and seeing the friendly people over here. And I think for those of you interested in soccer, I think the match last night between Norway and Iraq was really, it was a truly interesting thing. It was wonderful to see all the people also interested in soccer over here.
Yeah, we're making progress on the soccer front. So, and
I made the mistake of calling it football.
I was going to say soccer already. Yep. We're bringing you to the U.S. side, and excited to kind of keep that U.S. theme today as we talk about the FDA specifically and some of the FDA regulations and compliance guidelines that are specific to the states. And I know many of our webinars and our content is based on just general guidelines and kind of a mix of global requirements. But since you were here today, wanted to talk specifically about FDA compliance. But before we jump in there, wanted to just take a minute and say, hey, we are both from Eupry. We are one vendor, one solution for all of your thermal GXP needs. If you want to learn some more about us, you can do so on eupry.com. All of our hardware, software specifications are there. And then before we end up with this question in the chat, this webinar will be online, so you can hear us talk. You can also hear all the slides, see them for yourself, and go ahead and access those at any time moving ahead. So all this content will be available if you have to jump out early or if you want to reference it moving forward. So a bit about Eupry. Been around going on 12, 13 years at this point. We have a number of sensors all over the world at this point, and find ourselves at all kinds of pharma locations as well as pharma logistics locations. So a number of names here that you likely recognize that have kind of global pharma and logistics footprints. And we meet a number of compliance standards, both based on European standards and the FDA here in the States, which we'll talk about today. Cool. So if we jump in from there, we wanted to spend some time today on what does the FDA actually expect from your mapping program in 2026? And, started this with kind of the focus on mapping, but we'll talk about like, what does it mean to go beyond mapping in some of our conversation today?
Absolutely.
So we've broken this out into 5 individual questions, and feel free to kind of wander about as we go through these. But I'm excited to learn a bit from you and hear a bit about the specifics for the FDA here, as we hear a lot of this conversation when we're selling and when we're servicing our products here in the States, and know in many times kind of regulations and where the benchmark is kind of depends on where the headquarters of the customer that we're working with may be. So excited to have a bit of a US focus today.
Absolutely. And I think it's also really important to mention that we both see this from European and American companies, right?
Yes.
It's alike. Whenever you deal with the US market, you need to apply by the FDA guidelines. And I think it's also quite important for me to mention already from the get-go. I mean, a lot of this information is not often shared, which is a bit of a shame, right?
Yep.
But of course, I understand as a company, you might not want to share every single figure you have out there. So, I mean, a lot of the information we gather and a lot of the intelligence we gather from the market are both with the partnerships we have from our customers. I think I'm very proud that we have partnerships rather than just selling one-off solutions or one-off products. So we have quite a close collaboration with our customers in terms of what are the tendencies we're seeing with FDA, with EMA, whoever it might be. And then, of course, when it becomes a little bit more unpleasant, of course, with the warning letters, I think it's a very nice solution that the FDA has implemented that, well, we can see and we can learn from each other. I know it might sometimes, when you're in the eye of the hurricane, might not be the most fun experience, but at least it makes sure that we can all learn from those experiences. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is also going to be based both on intelligence from the market, what do we hear, but also what we see from warning letters.
Yes.
And I think also on that note, please use the chat function on the right of your screen. give your inputs, give your questions. These webinars always get better when we have a lot of input from various persons within this field.
Yeah, 100%. We'll come back to those questions at the end. We should have time to run through them with that. Whether they be short or long, we can dive into them with some depth as we wrap up. So let's jump into our first question from there. You mentioned warning letters, and it seems there was a bit of a spike in those at the beginning of this year. So what are the FDA inspectors actually flagging on temperature mapping right now? And how has that maybe changed, or what's driven some of the kind of recent jump in kind of letters that a variety of folks may have received?
Well, I was lucky that you gave me the questions before this webinar. So I think I'm going to focus on three different things from the intelligence that we have from the warning letters. I think first and foremost, it's very rare that we see the FDA having specific citations based on temperature mapping alone, which also brings me to the first point, which is what we hear is often also that it's not necessarily that the FDA will trigger or will make a citation or a notification just based on data that has been collected that's just slightly off. It's way more about the system in place that you have in place, whether that be the technical systems or your quality management systems or functional processes, that you have a strong foundation for investigating when something goes wrong. It's perfectly fine if something goes wrong, if we're talking mapping specifically. But that's one of the things we're really starting to see an increased focus on, is that you have a strong system in place to gather, to revisit, to review the data, to review your mapping processes, your strategies, to ensure that the process is right, and that you might have slippage of data. That's perfectly fine, but you have a system in place that captures these slippages and captures any deviations. And that also leads me to the next point of what we're seeing a lot is because also as the FDA inspectors are also moving from this approach from very static validation to more assurance-based approach across the field, from process validation to computerized systems validation and so forth, we're seeing that there's sometimes an observed difference, what we call them, from mapping to monitoring gap. So one of the experience sometimes where we pick up on our customers is also that you might have performed a mapping, and that mapping might have been performed according to all guidelines, and every dot and cross T and everything has been in order. But using that information into your operation has gone wrong. So we've seen cases where recommendations from mapping reports have been left in the report rather than being carried over to actual operation. And the FDA starts to, in our opinion at least, starts to have an increased focus on your process of making sure you validate, you do the process validation, but also that you carry the learnings over to the next year and to your operation. And that's also what we're seeing in terms of what we call targeted enforcement. But we see a lot of inspections starting to focus on the history of how you've worked with your processes, targeting weak processes rather than just here and there violations of in this case temperature violations or humidity or whatever, and showing repeated deficiencies in your process rather than just individual events. One of the things we see also cited quite a lot is that the amount of investigations into non-conforming results, and specifically with regards to environmental monitoring, is one of the more cited citations from cited processes from the FDA in the warning letters, that you either don't monitor closely the outcomes of your processes and also the pure monitoring data. So that in essence, you fill all the boxes, you do all the monitoring, but you don't pick up on what tendencies you achieve from these monitoring solutions. I hope that makes some sort of sense.
Yeah, well, we've talked for a long time about the idea of continuous monitoring and that being different than mapping. And what I'm hearing is that that you need to do the mapping and you need to be learning from that throughout. And in one way or another, there's just acceptance of and an opportunity to continue to monitor over time, and that is becoming the expectation rather than, something that maybe only the most proactive folks or only the folks with an opportunity to implement new systems are expected to do.
I mean, absolutely. And also, as a great example, one of the things we're also hearing out there is that even though if we take, as with this webinar, mapping and monitoring, one of the themes that keep popping up is that you perform your mapping with the sensors as suggested by the ISP or the WHO guidelines, and that's all fine and good. But then you resort to having like 2 sensors left in a warehouse. We've seen cases of that. Okay, as per the recommendation, that might be a fine approach. But if you look closer in the data that you get through your process validation, you do find risk areas where that approach is not sufficient anymore. And hiding behind those recommended guidelines, we're starting to see the FDA have an increased focus on, well, you need to have critical thinking. You need to use a risk-based approach, not to just justify doing less, but actually to focus on the areas that have actual risk.
Yes.
I mean, and no matter how well you do a mapping study, if you go into monitoring and the periods between your mapping studies, you might have everything documented stating, I don't need to do a mapping because X, Y, Z. Well, if your product and other tendencies start to show that you might do it, well, then it's not enough anymore to say, well, we always map every 3 years. Because if you start spotting tendencies that show otherwise, the FDA is going to notice that. And they expect you to take that approach with continuous temperature mapping. That's one approach to doing it, but diligence is certainly also another.
Yeah, and just to, I don't know, say the quiet part out loud there, what I'm hearing is that, I have in conversations heard people say, hey, I don't want to continuously monitor things because I might be afraid of the alarms that would pop or the information we would find. And that is somehow punitive in the FDA's mind. And what I'm hearing is that like alarms aren't a bad thing. Like finding out that there are trouble areas isn't a bad thing as long as we're correcting for them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also one of the questions we also get, like we're seeing an increased interest in saying, well, is humidity monitoring, relative humidity monitoring needed? And I think that question in itself highlights the FDA's approach to saying, well, you can't find the answer to that question just by from a generalistic perspective.
Yeah.
You need to have that understanding of your product. You need to have that understanding of what the impacts to the products you're storing are, and then make your decision based on that. And I think it's a very positive development in many sense, because we're actually starting to have a closer link between what the real impact is and then what we need to monitor. In both the sense of monitoring more, but also sometimes monitoring less. But I think we're seeing the pendulum swing a bit here from, well, we got introduced to the risk-based approach, and I think a lot of organizations saw that as an opportunity to downplay some of the diligence, which is, I mean, can be done in certain areas, but also you need to have an increased focus. But yeah.
Well, I think that leads us well into our next question, which is around the idea of risk-based mapping and a risk-based approach, as you mentioned. Like with humidity, there may not be a right answer for how you meet or exceed FDA guidelines. You have to develop a process or a set of recommendations that work for you and your business and the requirements that are associated with that. And that's maybe scarier because like that means you have to kind of justify your own position and establish what that looks like. And that's a bit different than how EU regulators work. So talk a little bit about how FDA's kind of risk-based approach differs, what that means in practice for the exercise of temperature mapping, and where does that kind of break down or cause some friction, maybe if you come from the EU and kind of used to dealing with things one way, and maybe you're opening a US location or move to a company that has both EU and US locations, and you're forced to kind of grapple with sometimes contradictory sets of standards.
Well, I think first of all, I would hesitate to agree 100% with the statement that they are contradictory. But I think from what we're hearing as well with our customers, the FDA has had a label of being more checklist based, I think, in the past, and I think they've actually moved way faster than EMA in terms of applying the risk-based approach in a value-added setting. So what I mean by that is that what we often find, at least, is that European companies are way more likely to follow recommendations. At least, well, it depends. I mean, you can find outliers in both segments. I don't want to downplay European companies, but what we're seeing at least is that the FDA has an approach where you need to justify your risk assessment to a large extent, and also and to a large extent also scientifically, to justify why you have certain approaches over than others. I think one of the I think over the last 1 or 2 years, we've really seen is, as we mentioned before, that the risk-based approach does not only mean that you have to have less effort. I think that was a large part of the selling point when it initially came out, which it makes good sense, because I think in any realistic scenario, you do not have infinite resources to investigate every single thing.
Right.
And that realistic view on the amount of resources available to do quality-related work has actually improved the quality overall. But I think in order to satisfy the FDA inspectors at least, what we see is that rather than going off a checklist of predefined risks, you really need to get down to the root of where your risks originate from. Get back to the product, the process, and really develop from there the strategies with all the recommendations and guidelines at the back of your mind. Where in my view, at least from an EMA perspective, they are much more reliant on the guidelines and ensure that you checklist those and then apply risk-based approach on top of that. But I do think that there's a large team, well, there's not large team, there's a large amount of homogeneity between the European method and the FDA method, but you still need to be able to justify, why did I choose less loggers? Why did I choose more? And I think from our perspective, at least from what we hear from the market, is that the FDA inspectors are much more willing to discuss your risk assumptions on that basis. And the last thing I want to mention is that we're seeing an increased focus on justification of your risks. So how did you get to the decision that you've made? How do you get to the methodology that you've chosen? And I think it's an interesting little story, but I think we've helped a few customers who've, I think it's a funny little example, but they relied quite a lot on our assumptions or our risk assessments rather than their own, and that doesn't really fly well with the FDA. They need to see that it comes from within the organization. Of course, we're always more than happy to help. It's partnerships that we build, not just providing one-offs, but the teams on site, they need to be able to explain to the inspectors where did these justifications come from and how are they backed up.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because every customer we have out there has a variety of equipment, has a variety of challenges, and some of those are very consistent, right? Like there are lots of people with Eupry loggers, there's lots of people with similar kind of baseline fridges or freezers. Like there is some best practice there, but there is a level of like thinking through your own scenarios that needs to sit on top of that.
Don't get me wrong, best practices are there for a reason. I mean, they'll cover a large percentage and even sometimes 100% of your coverage needs in terms of satisfying the inspectors. But what we are seeing is that you need to understand the underlying assessments of why those are best practices. And I think that's why I love temperature mapping as well, as like most of the guidelines out there, they describe a lot of the best practices, but do you understand why those are best practices? And why can we apply these best practices to our needs and to our processes as well? And having that description in place. And I think from some of the success stories we've had, at least, it doesn't have to be an enormous amount of work, but just understanding as a simple thing as the temperature mapping will be placed in the corners and the center of the volume. Why? Well, best practice, try again.
Yeah.
Well, it's because we might have areas that do not conform to temperature. Great. You understood the risk. You understand why the best practice was applied that way, and you can justify it all. And the same thing goes for, as an example, with these temperature mapping studies. They tend to focus a lot on just homogeneity of temperatures. Are all temperatures within range? But what about stability of temperature? Well, that depends on your product. Are you storing pellet tanks? Well, stability is a minor issue. Are you storing small vials? Well, then there's a large issue. And those differences, you need to understand. You need to be able to justify them and explain them to an inspector.
Yeah, that makes sense. And back to kind of where Eupry gets, maybe a lot of insight is, we oftentimes hear from folks who are doing their first mapping. We oftentimes hear from folks who are upfitting a new facility, but maybe the most common use case we hear is the idea of a remapping. And looking at the FDA expectations, like what are the triggers that kind of push you towards an FDA expectation of a remapping at this point? And one, how do you know that those are coming? And two, how are you prepared for some of the scenarios that you're talking about in terms of justification to say, hey, we did a remapping, here's why, and here's how that either makes sense for us to go to a great level of depth or perhaps not in that remapping.
So I think that's a perfect example of why you need to have that described upfront, because you can show the justifications upfront. One example I have with one of our partners that, okay, sorry. You already had the question up there, sorry.
We did a good segue.
Yeah, good segue. One of a great example I have with a customer of ours, I should not, of course, not mention the name, but they actually got it was not a citation, but it came close, was they had not yet reached the point at which a remapping would make sense or would have been triggered or whatever, but they still got a close call. And why? Because they had not described what the decision rules were. So they had not really described it as, well, we'll follow the guidelines, yes, but for you specifically, what is a change that will actually trigger it? And of course, there's some general recommendations. So I think also some of the genuine triggers, like we call them genuine triggers, but those are the sort of the lowest hanging fruits, right? Like if you do HVAC modifications, if you do different rackings, you do capacity changes or operational changes. So that's the lowest hanging fruit. Like you do large changes to your temperature control system, you need to have that in there. That's just like, that's 5 lines in your policy. Very easy to get over with, and you're like 50% there. The second thing, and I think that's where FDA really starts to have a focus, is on in terms of your tendencies. So as we mentioned from the beginning, what we're seeing is that they start to have an increased focus on companies that do tendency analysis. They'll write out the temperature profiles, they'll do a lot of different things, but how do you react on it? And if you're starting to see, and you'll see several citations of this, you start seeing tendencies going the wrong way, but you do not even consider a remapping to be performed. I mean, one thing is the practical implementation. You know you're disturbing your system, and you need to assess that somehow, big or small, and it can be quite difficult to be fairly honest. But the other thing is you're actually seeing output that tells you a story that something might be going wrong, and you do not act. And that's where we're starting seeing the FDA have a lot more focus on that process in itself. So that also brings me to the next thing, which we'll call the real gate, which is basically what you're actually looking for is a thorough risk assessment. And it can be upfront, it can be a defined set of changes that you decide will actually have a trigger, a remapping. But the second part of it is just focusing on actually measuring the outcome. And there's, I think with the advent of more reasonably priced data loggers, and I'm going to say our own in there as well, is that you can actually gather much more data to show whether the outcome has actually changed. The last thing I want is one of the myths that we often hear as well is like, oh, what if I start doing like-to-like changes, or what if I have seasonal changes? Well, the thing is, those should already have been covered in your mapping strategy. So yes, that might trigger a remapping, but it should already have been part of your mapping studies in the beginning. So sometimes we're seeing also a little bit of confusion between what is a remapping and what is part of your initial process validation.
Yeah. What I'm hearing there is like we're inching towards proactivity, right? You're seeing tendencies, you're seeing outcomes, but like that's all pushing you towards like, hey, before this is an issue, let's make sure we're addressing the challenges that occur.
Yes, and also I think now we've recently ran a project in Eupry where we looked at large data sets for warehouses and fridges and such, and it's become quite clear that it's not always that you need necessarily to trigger alarms before knowing that something is wrong. If you take a traditional approach with hotspot and cold spots, a lot of things can happen. We've done some quite nice tests looking at different units over time, and the assumption that you need to see actual deviations as a tendencies that triggers you to do remapping, that is actually wrong. And you really need to start, tendencies that go the wrong way, you need to act on them. And it all goes back to what we're seeing as the FDA's approach. They tend to focus on your process and that you're actually acting on the data you're getting from your various systems.
Yeah, so it's a slight tangent there, but one of the things that we hear if you go kind of across the Eupry business is you talk to our support team or you talk to some of the teams doing setup of kind of our systems, is that we offer alarms for monitoring, and as soon as you offer alarms, one of the biggest points of frustration is alarm fatigue, right? I get too many of these, like, oh, that wasn't an important one or whatever else. And just talk for a minute about like, okay, so we want to make sure we are understanding tendencies, but and an alarm isn't punitive, but we want to make sure we're understanding when we may be approaching a challenge or we may see something moving the wrong direction. So like, alarms aren't always bad, but we need to be looking at this data outside of alarms. So like they're kind of two contradictory ways to think about that.
I think one of the things that have always struck me as a little bit weird is that most organizations that we talk to, their only tendencies is to look at the amount of alarms. And that's sort of like only taking your car for service when you have a flat tire or an engine problem. Well, it's too late at that point in time. That would be a terrible tendency to look at from my perspective. But there are other metrics to look for, like just something as simple as a rolling average, like do the temperatures, looking at the homogeneity, looking at the stability of temperatures, rather simple statistic analysis of your usage or of your units. Of course, the amount of alarm does make sense. Like if you start to get a lot of alarms, it might indicate that something is off. And then I think that the last thing is that, well, you are allowed to do sort of sample testing. You don't need to do a full-scale remapping. You can have a few data loggers placed. If you're worried that like a small unit or a larger facility, there might be something wrong, just place a few data loggers for a few days, see whether it aligns up with the data from your mapping, and you have a great input for your risk assessment. It doesn't have to be so binary that you either do nothing or you do the full thing.
Yeah.
Like, there's some steps in between, and we see very few organizations actually apply this, which I've always wondered, because it's a great input.
But I think that's a good takeaway in general, is like, it's not an alarm or no alarms, and it's not a full mapping or no mapping. Like you need to be able to exist in the gray and understand what's happening there across the board, and that will help make it clearer when you need to do a full remapping or not. But like it can't be a binary decision.
Yeah, exactly. And also in terms of binary, it's not that if you look at larger facilities, that's more often the case. Like it's not like your whole facility is compliant or not. You can have areas that are fine or more risky or less risky, but it all leads down to your understanding of what is the product we're storing, what is the process requirements, and then which areas live up to those requirements and which do not, and which are like in the gray zone on the borderline.
Yeah. Great. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about why is the FDA increasingly citing facilities for missing humidity or CO2 data when the original mapping maybe was temperature only?
So I think I don't think the FDA is running like a campaign against temperature only mappings, although sometimes it might seeing it. What we're in our perspective, at least, what we're seeing is that the FDA has an increased focus on, as I said in the beginning, do you understand what affects your product? Do you understand what affects your process? And I've never seen a warning letter saying, well, you didn't have a mapping for X, Y, Z, or it's often you didn't have a process in place to investigate the environmental factors that might have affected X, Y, Z. So I think one of the core issues here is that we can't look at specific citations, say you had a mapping or whatever. It's more that we're seeing citations and also in general findings from inspectors that you didn't understand your process, you didn't understand what environmental factors, rather you looked up in some general guidelines or industry best practices and you did that. I think that captures the core of what we're seeing here, and I think it's also a matter of the amount of product stored and the type of product stored. We're seeing a lot more environmental factors coming into play, but I think it's really important to understand that it has always been this way. I mean, you never had the chance to just say, well, we'll map temperature alone. That's the general guideline. You always had to scope your studies so that they made sense to the products you have, and that justification, some would call it risk assessment, still needs to be there. But we're just seeing the FDA having an increased focus on making sure you have that justification in place.
Yeah, I feel like being certainly newer to the industry than yourself, like temperature was always the table stakes, and increasingly like there's no reason not to be pulling in some of these other elements more consistently, and maybe we're just all becoming a bit more aware of that temperature alone isn't enough.
Not always, at least. I think it really depends, and that's also why it's impossible to give it like a one concise, concrete answer to that question. But I think, remember that the FDA wants to see that you can follow logically from your product, from your process, all the way up to your methodologies and your testing strategies. They want to see that, and they want to see that you continuously do so, and that you have a strategy in place to follow up on those activities.
Great. So our last of our 5 questions here, kind of a clean slate. Imagine you're rebuilding a U.S. pharma facilities mapping program from scratch today. So we have no dead weight. We have nothing that's
nothing. That's back. What we did last year. Yes, everything is just
like, nothing but greenfield. What would you do differently today than 5 years ago?
That's I think that's probably my dream question because you get to imagine one of, I would say, the tendencies we're starting to see now, that's mostly within large organizations where they're moving towards, I think there's a few large players who are really at the forefront of this, is to think of it as a system rather than projects. Just like you have a quality management system or a strategy, to have a more assurance approach to it. So when you have something simple as fridges, for example, those tend to not have a great variance across applications in your organization. So the general approach to how you define the requirements, how you define the testing methodologies, those can be pretty much shared across your entire organization. And if it was my organization, I would definitely start out by defining a general strategy and then applying that across the organization. First, it makes it a whole lot easier. Secondly, it forces you to, or doesn't force you, it allows you to really focus in on what matters and think about the different use cases. And thirdly, it's just way more efficient. And I think whenever we get more efficient processes, we tend to focus on the things that actually provide value. I think secondly would be a more data-driven approach. So when I say data, I might should have say information, but basically using the data you have from your systems or from your monitoring systems to continuously update your approach. So we get to a lot of clients that will say, well, we have this mapping strategy in place. That's how we've always done it. Even though the technology evolves over time, like temperature controlled equipment has evolved dramatically, not only in terms of power usage, certainly in terms of power usage, but also in terms of stability, what methodologies can be used to test. They are much more like today. well, it's a little boring if you're a quality engineer, I think, but most equipment today passes. But it's much more about using the data today to actually provide value, to update your processes, have more agile processes so that you can learn across the strategy. And I think you can only do that if you have one system to control it. It doesn't have to be like one software system, but at least one system to apply to all of these different units. And the last thing, of course, I truly believe this, otherwise we wouldn't have launched this continuous temperature mapping and monitoring. I would combine those two following the ISP guidelines. So that's also one of our great success stories here at Eupry, right? Is combining both the temperature mapping and monitoring into one so that you continuously map every single day, basically. It has less cost, it has less diversity. You don't need to do all of your risk assessments because basically you get the data out from the system telling you whether the output changed. You don't need to assess whether your input had a great enough effect that your output changed. But you can basically apply continuous temperature mapping and monitoring in one go, and you're set for the lifetime of the equipment. That's what I would do, because I'm lazy, and I think as most of my colleagues in the field are.
I think there's efficiency and laziness.
Yeah, and those go well in hand.
That's right. That's right. Let's do a quick recap here on just things that I've heard from this conversation. The first is that the FDA does not approach things in a kind of checkbox, checklist, did you meet requirements sort of fashion anymore. And you need to be able to kind of not only justify your own processes in place, but you need to be thinking about them proactively ahead of any kind of interaction you may have with the FDA. And it's kind of too late to just wait for whatever citation or notes you may get from them. The next would be that there are a number of ways that you can kind of exist in the gray area today, right? It is not enough to wait for an alarm or wait for a citation in some way, and it is up to you to understand tendencies and be proactive in an increasing way. And I think that leads us into kind of the last bucket, which is that mapping itself and kind of meeting these requirements is not a once or twice a year or like when you decide to replace HVAC equipment type decision, and that you need to be looking at this data on a more ongoing basis, even if it is not a full-fledged continuous monitoring strategy. But it's not enough just to once in the summer, once in the winter, kind of address these things. It needs to be a more ongoing thought process, and probably kind of internal investigation prior to any FDA interaction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great.
Agree.
I learned 3 things from today's conversation. We've got a few minutes left here, and we've got a couple of questions from the team. So let's jump into these. The first is from Julia. Do you need to conduct an open door test for freezers with simulated product inside? And if you do, what would be the outcome of that? Is it necessary? Would you need a 24-hour mapping? And would that be sufficient without open door during that 24 hours? So a couple questions in there, but
I think, but this is a great question. First of all, I think, and it's also one of the questions we get a lot. So let me put it another way. If you were to follow the guidelines just by the word and the best practices, you would need to do both a stability study and a door opening study, not with any simulated, or it depends on what you mean with simulated product. The guidelines are quite clear. You need to do a stability study, empty and full, so that would be empty and with simulated product. You need to do the door opening studies, empty and full. So here comes a great example. That's what the guideline says, and you can use. If you just hate having free time, I mean, that's a great approach. Now comes applied risk-based approach. So a door opening study is a great example. Should I do it both full and empty? Well, the guidelines mandate that, but you can use risk-based approach to say, well, what is the worst case of those two? So the worst case, if we're talking something like a fridge, if you don't have any thermal mass in the volume there, well, then the empty state is definitely going to be the worst case. So we'll say, okay, well then I get rid of the study with the simulated goods in there. Then the next question would obviously be, well, do I need a door opening study as well? Well, then I would turn around and say, well, an inspector would ask you the question, is that a risk to your product? Is it a risk that sometimes you need to open the door? It's a very unusable fridge if you don't ever open the door. So most likely you will have to open the door. Well, it's a risk. How did you mitigate that? Well, I did a study. Oh, great. So you have data to have a certain degree of certainty or assurance that it did not affect it unnecessarily. So that's the approach. That's the mindset you need to use on this, rather than just focusing on what is in the guidelines. Why do we need a door opening study? And if you understand the why, well, it's a very simple decision. And also back to the 24-hour mapping study, stability. We often get questioned like, how many hours do I need to do it? Well, what is the risk? What's the underlying risk behind the 24 hours? Some say 24, some say 48, some say 72, 2 weeks, whatever. Well, what is the risk? Well, the reason why we do it more than just 1 minute is because we know that if you take a period of time, the conditions are going to change ever so slightly. So you need to look at your data and say, okay, how much is enough to have enough information to show us that if I do it over 24, that will be representative of a year. Well, a really well-made mapping strategy will say, okay, well, how is the operation of this unit? Do we have people on staff during weekends? So does weekend and weekdays look different? The room in which is in, does that change temperature, or is it really tightly controlled? Well, it changes ever so slightly during the week. Well, then I choose, during the week, or does it have an impact? All of those assumptions that you have, all of those data points as part of your risk assessment, if you can explain them to an auditor or an inspector, well, I mean, you'll be at top of the class, right? Understand why you chose one and not the other. It's really part of it. So yes, you need to do both. Sorry.
The short answer, yes.
Yeah.
Great. Another question here from Adam. Can I ask, what are the expectations for temperature monitoring of a temperature-controlled location after a successful mapping, but before the unit is connected to a real-time monitoring system? Yes, so the handoff period. Is this purely risk-based? How do you handle that kind of intermediate time, maybe as you're commissioning something new or as processes are changing?
So a really good question, actually. It's quite rare we get that question, but I would say you need to have assurance constantly that the conditions meet the predefined criteria. So during that handoff process, what we see, I mean, the low practical application is just to leave the mapping sensors in there until you connect it to a real-time monitoring system. In our case, it's the same system, so you just leave them behind it. It continuously monitors. But another approach where we see this, which might exemplify this a little bit better, is that we see cases where we have warehouses that need a winter and a summer mapping. And if you were to, I mean, the slowest approach would be to perform the winter mapping, take down the loggers, wait half a year, do the summer mapping, and then go into operation. But across the board, wherever in the world, we see great applications of, you start the winter mapping, so you set up your loggers, but you know that there might be changes from the winter mapping up until the summer season. So you leave behind all the mapping sensors in there, have an increased level of vigilance, and go into operation immediately, because you have real-time data showing you whether something has changed that's not within the criteria. You perform your summer mapping, and then you go into quote-unquote normal operation. So the real thing is, yes, you need to apply risk-based approach. But again, what is the risk? The risk is that when we take down our mapping sensors, we start changing the operations, something might change. So if you've got your risk assessment already there, or at least the inputs for your risk assessment, and then then it's a matter of is it so like the process you're moving into, so that you don't need an extra vigilance, or is it just normal operation after that? I hope that made some sort of sense.
It does, and this is going way back in my career, but I always like the phrase visibility equals value. Right. And so, just doing a mapping study saying, great, we passed, and then saying, okay, cool, we'll do another one in the summer. But, you have pressure to use that space and to, not leave it there, without purpose for that period of time. So like, how do you work around that? Well, like if you have visibility into what's going on there, you can then make decisions around whether it's fit for purpose during that time.
Yeah, and you can by the hour, every single hour you can have an assessment on, and that's the whole idea behind the continuous mapping and monitoring, is that you constantly know whether it's all right or not.
Right.
You don't have to guess.
Yes.
So I think if you ask me the question of what would I do new, if you ask me that 10 years in the future, I don't think we'll have mapping reports anymore.
Yeah.
We'll just have assurance, ongoing assurance with an increased amount of loggers that continuously the space in which we're storing products is fine. And we won't have to think about these event-based activities anymore.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know whether I believe it to be so, or I hope it to be so. Maybe.
Yes. Yes. Well, and perhaps like the detail of the mapping, is a redundancy.
Yeah, because the concept doesn't make sense anymore when you start thinking about assurance instead. Yeah.
Yes. And as I often hear from folks, like I have on my phone a sensor that tells me exactly what the temperature is in my spare bedroom at my house. Like, why don't we have these everywhere?
Yeah, exactly.
Great. One final question from Anna. Some temperature systems give you the option to mark a reading or pause readings. What would be the use of this, and what are the risks? In what situation would you use these functionalities?
So starting with the pause readings, I would never do that. Because I think this really goes back to the concept of being in control. So you might have periods of time, let's say during cleaning of a fridge, for example, where you have spikes in your whatever environmental parameters. And again, that's totally fine. What the FDA wants to see is that you know why this spike occurred, you acted upon it, maybe even preemptively because you knew that, but you're not afraid to show data that's outside the limits because you knew why. I think from a journalistic perspective, that's a stronger position to be in when the inspectors show up on site than why didn't you have data from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Yes. Well, you start explaining whatever. So the pause readings, I would never use that if it in a sense make it. Also because all the modern systems out there, they don't run out of memory that they'll have. It really doesn't. I think it's a relic functionality.
When we talked about that a little bit earlier, that like an excursion or an alarm isn't punitive.
Yeah, exactly.
The goal isn't to stay between the lines.
No.
Right? It's if you go outside the lines, which is a perfectly normal thing to happen, we're aware of it and we have an understanding of how to correct for it.
Exactly. And sometimes even and that's maybe back to the other question, to mark a reading. So sometimes what we see is like we want to, like we do in our system, you can do root cause analysis of the alarms you have in there, and you can mark them as not relevant. So if that's what's meant by marking a reading, that's perfectly fine. You give a informed decision on why these readings were as they were, and the inspector is just happy. Because you can justify, that no product was harmed because maybe you didn't store any products or whatever. Yeah.
Great. That's a wonderful place for us to leave it. We are just a couple minutes ahead of schedule. So appreciate all of your questions. Appreciate everybody's time today. Appreciate your thoughts and you joining us here across the pond. We wish you a safe trip back. Just to repeat, this session will be online. The whole recording with all the slides, the questions, everything else, as well as a whole bunch of other information from Jakob, our team, and otherwise. So visit eupry.com if you'd like to learn a bit more or review this session in the coming days. And thank you all for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.